Sure. So we're from JPAL, which is the Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab. It's a network of researchers, about 260 researchers who are based in universities around the world. And they're brought together by their commitment to bring scientific evidence to questions of policy on poverty reduction. So all of these researchers use what are called randomized controlled trials, a specific kind of research, which we can talk a bit more about, to ensure that we have really credible and rigorous evidence when we think about public policies, new innovative programs or interventions that can in different ways accomplish the goal of reducing poverty. JPAL is headquartered at the Massachusetts Institute for Technology, or MIT, in Boston, but we work for JPAL Europe, which is our Europe regional office, based at the Paris School of Economics. And our goal is really to find ways to promote this kind of research, to share what we already know from research that's been done around the world. So the network has conducted over 1,100 studies in a whole range of subjects everywhere. And we're very excited to be here in Uzbekistan this week at the invitation of the Center for Economic Research and Reform to think about what that research has to say for the mission of poverty reduction in Uzbekistan, and how we can build in some of that research in, or sort of collaborate on research ideas to help the government and other organizations in Uzbekistan think about the progress that they're making in reducing poverty.
Yes, it's been very interesting to hear of all the efforts that Uzbekistan is currently implementing to fight poverty at the micro and the macro level with very ambitious reforms. So we're very excited to be here and learn more about what you're doing, but especially how we can better support you in this effort. As Killian was mentioning, we want our research to be policy relevant, which means we work with our counterparts in government in better understanding what their priorities are, where research could be more relevant, and how together we can answer questions that are relevant to fighting poverty in Uzbekistan and worldwide.
And so some of the kind of policy questions that we've been discussing this week in different meetings and in our workshop are thinking about social protection efforts, education in particular, and also how to create good jobs and sort of provide for the growth of firms and entrepreneurs. And I think throughout all of the work that we do, JPAL's goal, as Carla mentioned, is to sort of produce research that can be used. So to think about measuring innovative approaches, new ways of thinking about how can we increase the sort of learning of students in schools? How can we increase access to education? How can we promote more jobs, sort of find ways to create jobs, but also help people find those jobs and stay in those jobs? And the goal is to kind of produce findings that governments and other organizations can use to then scale up these programs in many cases. So to think about where's the best investment of resources to ensure that policies have their intended effect.
I think that's a very interesting question, and one that JPAL has been grappling with. So what we say is that we produce evidence that is locally grounded or globally informed. So what this means is that we use the research that we have done all over the world to inform policies that can be applied to a particular local context. So what we try to do is to understand what are the underlying behaviors that interventions try to solve that are generalizable to a wider population, and then see if the local context applies to use that intervention. So this is what we call the generalizability framework. And we work with governments all over the world in better understanding what the evidence that we already have says, whether that evidence could be relevant to their context, and then work hand in hand with governments in applying that evidence to the context when it is relevant. So it's a mix of having evidence that is global, but also a very clear understanding of the local context. That is why we say we are globally informed, but locally grounded.
And so as an example, in some of the conversations that we've been having this week in the workshop, we've been thinking about what the evidence on social protection schemes says globally, looking at questions like how do you reach the right people, thinking about the poorest households, how do you find where they are, think about whether they meet eligibility criteria for social protection programs, and thinking about research that's been done in other countries, and then asking the question of people and helping them think through to what extent does this match concerns here in Uzbekistan, to what extent could it be useful for informing Uzbek policy, and to what extent do we need to also launch new research to understand specific realities or contexts that are present here in this country. I think different countries handle this in different ways, again, usually depending on local circumstances. But there's a lot of interesting approaches to thinking about, as I mentioned earlier, this question of how do we reach the right people? When we're thinking about social protection programs, for example, if we're trying to reach the poorest households, are there extra efforts that we need to make in certain regions of a country? Do we need to think about extra measures that may be more relevant for certain parts of a country? Sometimes thinking about, for example, if there's a lot of environmental risks or disaster risks in certain areas, how do we think about actually accommodating that into the way that the country approaches poverty reduction? Either what we might say ex post, after a disaster occurs or after some kind of problem, but maybe even ex ante or before the issue happens. How do we think about reducing the risks of problems that may exist in that region? I think all countries have a lot of regional variation in poverty, which based on a whole number of factors, and thinking about how we draw on those to think about different approaches in different regions is a really interesting research question, and I think one that's important to understand very well. It's one reason why a lot of the work that researchers do is focused on understanding in pretty micro-level detail how poverty may vary and sort of how different conditions vary in different parts of a country, and then linking that back to a national strategy. So I think there's a lot of interesting policy sort of choices there. But a lot of the research is focused on understanding particularly how programs, be they national or regional, affect different families in different ways, different regions, and helping us understand how different parts of the population might be affected in different ways. So a lot of research now looks particularly at whether programs focused on poverty reduction may affect men and women in different ways or children in different ways, and how we can, for example, if government transfers are being made to families, does it vary the effect, or does the impact vary if the transfer is made to the male head of household or female head of household? Questions like this. Do we have different effects on people who are employed, be they in the formal sector or in the informal sector? These are all really interesting questions that I think help answer this question that you've raised about whether or not a poverty strategy at national level needs to be complemented by some regional efforts.
This is very much related to what we were describing before about our generalizability framework, in the sense that we need to understand first if the underlying reasons behind these poverty are the same across regions. That is, if we're trying to solve the same problem across regions, or if the underlying causes for poverty are different, which would define our strategy. And so what we try to do is to understand what that underlying problem is, and then find the best intervention or best solution. Other things that might vary throughout regions are, for instance, the institutional context. Some governments have stronger capacity in some regions, and that gives them greater capacity for implementation. So that is also something that we need to consider when designing an intervention. The cultural context, how some things are perceived in one region might not be the same as another region. So just to highlight the importance of working with local governments and federal government in understanding the context as well as we can, so that we can bring in the best evidence that we have and also work together in answering whatever questions might be left where research could be more useful. Yes, so one of the things we're most passionate about is helping governments better understand and use the evidence. So we have what we call the learning cycle, which means guiding governments through the process of designing new interventions and incorporating existing evidence into that process, and also identifying additional research questions that we need to address when designing these interventions. So basically what we do is understand the context, understand the relevant evidence, and then help governments incorporate that evidence into their new programs. And we see this as an ongoing process. So this is not something that we think governments should do 1 or 2 times, but in a very recurrent way. And this is what we call institutionalizing a culture of evidence use. So what this means to us is basically changing the way that the government operates and incorporating evidence into as many decisions as they have, and in every way that they can. So we try to create a culture where governments have better access to administrative data, that data is better organized, better administered, that data is used to answer interesting research questions. There's a constant effort of understanding and generating new evidence that will then inform policy. So basically, the way we work is we try to influence governments to make them more aware of the importance of research, building capacity for them to generate and use that research, and then changing the system overall so that that becomes a new way of working, a new way of designing the policy.
And I think any government that has a strong poverty reduction mandate faces a number of questions around how do we measure the impact of the work that we're doing, what progress has actually been made in helping people move out of poverty, and how do we think about what that actually means? How do we both understand what poverty looks like in the country, but also what it means to move out of poverty, how sustainable that path might be. So I think that's where the research can be really useful in two different ways. One, in sort of providing a way to measure what's happened so far and to say to other policymakers, to the government, but also to the public at large, this has been the effect of the efforts. The resources that we've invested in this program or in this policy have yielded this transformation. I think that's very valuable. But it's also valuable to helping understand how to do it even better as you kind of progress in a poverty reduction strategy. So understanding if certain resources here may have some effect, that's a good thing, but they might even be more impactful if you deploy them in a slightly different way. So if you made some changes to the policy, a lot of the research looks at, for example, the costs of delivering certain programs. So you can think of that as the time that's needed by government employees or others to administer the program, the financial cost, of course, of actually paying for the benefits, whatever they may be, but also just the resource investment across the board. And sometimes the research that we're doing we'll find that a certain program is effective, but that if we make some small changes to it, it can be even more effective at a lower price. And so that can free up financial resources that can go into other efforts. So I think sort of across the board, it's this measurement of the progress that's being made, and also are there ways with using sort of new innovations that allow us to do even more with the same resources. So I think the role of local government officials at different levels of government and how they can be involved in meaningful ways in poverty reduction is a huge question, a research question, and one that varies in terms of the policies that different governments have taken, but a really fascinating one. And particularly, I think, an area where many governments have tried to invest more at local levels, where you have parts of government that are closer to the people, may understand and sort of see the challenges from a different perspective, have much more local information on the ground, understanding of the reality, and sort of can play a really active role in thinking about how government resources can be directed. So from what we've learned about this program, it sounds like a very interesting way of, or about this policy, I should say, it sounds like a very interesting area for further research to understand, again, what the impact of moving certain services to this level may be in terms of targeting government programming and thinking about where social protection in particular initiatives might be better focused to respond to those who are most in need. I think one thing that we've seen in many countries over the past 2 years in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and many of the lockdowns that followed in many countries, including Uzbekistan, that obviously created economic hardships for many families who might not have access to their regular jobs, that sort of thing. Part of the transformation that we've been seeing in how states respond to COVID-19 is thinking about how do we gather information about what's actually happening to people, particularly how their income may have changed as part of either a lockdown or just other economic changes that are going on. And local governments may have quite a bit of, and local officials may have quite a bit more information on some of these questions, and are also able to tap into other kinds of community resources to help understand what the reality is and how government efforts can be targeted in different ways. So I think this sounds like a really interesting shift, and one that would be particularly interesting as a research question to sort of understand how can this position and the resources that are given to the role and the ways in which those people play a role in government services, how can that have an impact in poverty reduction more generally?
I think we're leaving Uzbekistan very satisfied and very glad of the opportunity of having been here. We had very interesting discussions with different government officials from the Center of Economic Research and Reform, but other line ministries, for instance, education, labor, finance, social protection. And it was very exciting to see the participants engage in the workshop, asking more questions about the evidence that we have generated, but more particularly learning more about what they're doing, what their questions are, and how we can be more helpful. So We see this the beginning of a very interesting conversation that will move on for the next few weeks around where our support could be more helpful in understanding some research questions that still remain in all of the very ambitious efforts that Uzbekistan is now putting in place to fight poverty.
Sometimes as JPAL, I think we come and we worry that people will think that we bring more questions than answers. Because the network has not done research before in Uzbekistan or in the region, we were very conscious that we were coming to understand better what the realities are here in Uzbekistan and some of the ways in which research can be helpful. And I think one thing that was particularly exciting about the workshop for us was seeing how much interest there was in understanding some of the evidence from other parts of the world, but also thinking critically to what extent is this actually going to map well onto Uzbek priorities, or are there ways in which we actually need to adapt some of that programming and think about maybe piloting some of it, but understanding the impact of it a little bit better before applying it here. I think we came in the spirit not of saying this is what we think would be right for Uzbekistan, but saying we're here to understand with the government and with other partners how we can measure different programs and what might work best. So it's been a really, really enjoyable experience.